Hello, this is Deck of Ashes. Now, I've mentioned before in a previous video that when I find a game with a kind of a unique idea that I really like, I enjoy searching around and seeing if any other games are doing a similar thing, but hopefully with something to help them stand out and just play in a bit of a different way. And this has happened a lot with the very good Slay the Spire, which is of course the deck-building RPG with rogue-lite elements, and it has been very influential, as a couple of other videos of mine have attested to. And other devs have sort of taken those ideas and tried to make something that is their own out of them, with varying degrees of success. But this Deck of Ashes has a pretty unique couple of mechanics in here that very much change the way that deck building as a whole is actually done. And deck building is something that I really enjoy. In games, it's just, whether it's something like Ascension, where the entire game is actually based around that and has been for a long time, or something like this, where it's combined in a sort of like turn-based RPG. It's just a fun set of mechanics that involve a lot of like forward planning and strategy and things like that, and that just really appeals to me, I suppose you could say. So Deck of Ashes has really the titular Deck of Ashes in the game that is actually the sort of most unique mechanic, and I think that it's going to make the game very divisive for people. It's not going to be one of those games with a lot of middle ground, kind of, people that just sort of like it a little bit, enough to play it occasionally. It's going to be a game where you probably either really gel with the mechanics and it is really interesting to you and different, or you're not going to like the idea at all and it's just not going to click and you're probably not going to enjoy it. And that is that, you see, in most deck builders you have a discard pile, of course, where, you play a card and it eventually is discarded after you play it, and, once you run out of cards in your actual deck to draw, whenever you're supposed to draw, it will be, the entire discard pile will be reshuffled back into your deck to be put into your hand again. That's just normally how they work. And often in those games there are these cards they're basically burn cards. They're meant to be used like once per battle, because as soon as you use one, it actually doesn't get discarded and instead disappears from the battle, and you have to wait until the next battle to use it again. They're just like a one-time use thing. Imagine if every card in a deck builder was actually like that, and you kind of have the idea of Deck of Ashes. Basically, every card you play actually goes into the Deck of Ashes, as it's called, which is your discard pile that's a bit fancier than a normal discard pile, and it actually stays there. Even when you run out of cards to draw, they don't come back. That's it. Once it's in there, it sort of stays in there until there's some sort of external force that acts upon them to actually get them back for you. It's something that you have to actively choose to do. And one of the more common ways to do this in battle is the use of renew cards. Any card that has the renew keyword on it, which will usually it'll choose a random card from the Deck of Ashes and actually bring it back into your actual battle deck to be used again. And, there are lots of cards that you'll see that have things like discarding a random card and then renewing another one, or renewing multiple cards at once for a high cost, and things like that. So this is the main way you do it in battle. Also, there are some cards, importantly, that have the Phoenix keyword on them, which means that they do not get burned to the Deck of Ashes when they're used. They recirculate straight back into your battle deck instead. And what this really means mechanically is that your strategies, the general way that you would build a deck and the way that you use it in a battle in games like this, is not really how it works in this game. You have to do things quite differently because of this. For instance, it is very common to have a very efficient deck that you have added only specific things to and also taken a lot of things out of in a deck builder, so that pretty much every turn you are guaranteed to draw something productive for the strategy that you want to employ. But in this case, because those cards will go away and may not be available for the next battle, depending on what sort of resources you have, it's actually important to have a lot of redundant cards, multiple copies of the same card. In a normal deck builder, you would only want to have like 2 or 3 copies of a card, generally speaking, and in this, it's totally okay to have like 6, because, some of them might not be available all the time. And also, you might not only want to have a single strategy that the entire deck revolves around, but you want to have some backups and some other things that you can employ, because chances are, especially if you're in like a dungeon or something where you don't necessarily have the opportunity to renew all of your cards all the time, you still need it to be effective even if it's missing parts of itself, basically. So that definitely makes the actual deck building strategy of this game very different than your average deck builder. And you also see this after a battle. You have this camp system where you have these rest points, and you can have different numbers of those rest points, indicated by the little diamond shapes next to your portrait up there. But generally you start with about 5 or 6, and you can upgrade this and even have it temporarily upgraded and temporarily downgraded as well, depending on different things that happen. And you will spend these rest points after every battle to do things, and you can use them to craft cards. You also have to have ash, which is a resource that you get for killing enemies, usually. You can also renew cards, and different cards of different rarities have a different amount of rest points that they take to actually renew them from your deck of ashes back into your battle deck. And in order to do this, you will have to, usually forego other things that you can do with these rest points if you want to keep your deck full, basically. And because the other thing you can do with them that is important is heal yourself. It restores 10% of your health per rest point used. So let's say if you're in a dungeon, like I am here in the background, you may be getting hurt in quite a lot of battles, and because it's more like a gauntlet of quick battles than something like on the world map is normally, you really might have to choose oftentimes between healing yourself back to a safe level or renewing a bunch of your cards that you burned in the last battle. Usually you don't get to do both every time to like a high degree. So this makes it kind of interesting where you're in like a somewhat easier battle, so you're trying to think of a way that you can, how many cards can I get away with using in this battle that aren't my really expensive crazy cards that I may need to keep for the next battle, which is going to be much harder because I probably won't have the opportunity to renew all of them because I need to heal myself and things like that. You have to sort of think ahead a bit and try and do battles efficiently with what you have, and instead of just burning everything because, it won't come back that easily. There's also a system to prevent you from just running out of cards in battle and not being able to do anything at all if you don't have any of those Phoenix cards, for instance, or if they got discarded in some other way, which can happen. And that is when you go to draw and you actually have 0 cards left, you will get this card that allows you to renew 5 random cards. It always appears every time you run out, that way you always have the opportunity, but it costs health to use. I believe it costs 20 health to actually employ this card, so you are actually going to have to take some damage mid-battle if you want to renew a bunch of cards at once and you don't have any other cards left to do it with. So it is another way to, sort of strategize around. You have to try and not do this too often because it hurts, but it is always there if you need it, and in fact is sometimes necessary, especially in like longer boss fights and things where you just may have burned yourself out in an attempt to actually live, and so you have a bit of a problem there. And honestly, it's actually a really good deal if you think about it, because the healing is 10% of your health, which you start out at 100 health, so that's 10 health, which means it takes 2 rest points to restore those 20 HP that you lose from using this card, but you get 5 cards from it, which normally, even if they only cost the minimum amount each, which is 1, that would be 5 rest points, so 3 more that you'd have to use. So it's actually a really efficient trade if you're confident that you can survive using it. And of course you don't have any guarantee of what cards it's going to pull out of your deck of ashes because they're all random, but that, very much depends. There's also a camp system. It's separate from the actual camping after a battle, like an encampment that you return to. It's a persistent place in the world. It is at the center of every map that you go to, and it actually stays with you and is very reminiscent of something like the Manor in Darkest Dungeon, and that there are these various types of, you'll probably see them at the bottom right of the screen there, these various types of resources that you can get from finding them in the world. And you bring them back to the camp and you can perform persistent upgrades to the camp to actually make various aspects of yourself and of the camp itself stronger. And this camp also provides lots of ways to do a lot of the things that I've talked about without having to worry about rest points. For instance, you can renew your entire deck of cards for free there if you need to. You can also heal yourself just by buying some of these like poultices and things that a medicine lady kind of has for you. And there's also a blacksmith that allows you to craft cards at your leisure. You still have to have the same amount of ash, but you don't have to worry about rest points when you're crafting them. That's another interesting thing that I should mention about the game. And a lot of these games, when you win a battle or you find a chest, the card rewards that you get are added to your deck immediately. But in this case, that never happens. You always get recipes instead, things that you have to craft. So if you open a chest and whatnot, and there are multiple types of chests with different rarity cards on them, you will have to actually craft the cards that you get before they're added to your deck. Nothing actually just gives you something immediately, which is an interesting way to do it. You can also sell these recipes if you don't like them or don't need them right now for money, and buy other recipes at the merchant. And the various resources down there that you can find from mining nodes and killing enemies and opening chests and the like are used to get these permanent upgrades that involve everything from increasing the maximum number of rest points you'll have, to allowing you to buy these permanent stat increasing items to make yourself stronger, to things like allowing yourself the ability to dismantle cards for gold, for instance. If you want certain cards out of your deck, you don't want them in there anymore. You can even burn cards, pay gold to put them directly into the deck of ashes outside of battle if you don't have as many reliable ways to do it in battle, and maybe you want to go into a hard fight with all of them already burned. Now, why would you want to burn cards, you ask? That is because there are ash cards, which usually aren't playable. You have to have some way to discard them to actually get them into the deck of ashes, and the idea is that they do something only when they are in that deck. When they're in your normal one or when they're in your hand, they don't do anything. But when they're actually discarded, they provide some sort of bonus or passive effect, and they're very, very useful. They can do anything from like healing you every time you discard cards, to doing random damage to an enemy every time you do something, or making all of your damage over time effects able to crit and things like that. They can be very powerful. And so you may want to go into a battle with some of these actually, you know, already pre-burned, so you don't have to worry about doing it in battle if you're going to face like a boss or something. There is also a time system where every step you take or every action you take on the field passes an hour of time, and every 24 hours the camp restocks. And there's also a world boss, the actual sort of final boss of the chapter that you're in, that will slowly get closer and closer to finding you as you progress time, and eventually you will have to fight them. If their meter fills up, then you will be taken to camp for one final round of, you know, choices and healing and whatever else you may need to do, and then as soon as you leave camp, you will immediately be put into the final boss battle of the chapter, which often have really unique mechanics. Like this boss right here, for instance, has all sorts of weird fragile, which is like permanent or temporary one-use cards that he will put into your deck that you can use to help yourself out, but he constantly burns your cards away, for instance, and does all sorts of like horrible things to you. Makes it a really interesting fight. The world map itself is also, interestingly enough, split into biomes. You will be able to hover over a battle node and it'll tell you what biome it's actually going to be in, like a graveyard or like a sea area, and those biomes will have different groups of enemies that it can pull from. So obviously if you're in a graveyard, you'll fight undead, ghosts, skeletons, zombies, things like that. And there are also passive bonuses and debuffs that can happen depending on what biome you're fighting in, and they'll always be next to your health gauge there, so you can hover over them and see what they actually do. That's pretty cool, because that's actually one thing that is often a problem with early access games like this, is that the enemy variety is one of the later things that is actually expanded upon. They, you know, want to get the base mechanics solid first, which is understandable. But in this case, there's already quite a lot of enemy variety, actually, and there's a lot of different places to fight them, and that actually does matter. It does make a difference. It's not just like a backdrop that you look at. It actually has statistics and effects on you and the enemies that may make you change up your strategies a little bit, because you'll just basically have to. In fact, sometimes things don't even work at all. Like, for instance, you have these very powerful passive traits that you can get if you get the right upgrades from the blacksmith, and there are some areas where your traits just don't work. They disable themselves, and if you have built your strategy around those traits, then you will have to change it up a little bit because you won't have access to them. Overall, I think it's a really interesting entry in this whole deck building RPG thing, because it does things so differently. It does, in fact, actually make itself stand out by having mechanics that you don't normally see everywhere, and also I should mention that it is story-based. It is like a linear campaign. It is not like a rogue-lite. You don't do procedural runs or anything through it. You actually have a story with characters and progression and things like that in the actual story campaign, with different chapters and different bosses and all that stuff. So that's pretty cool, because not very many of these games actually do it that way. I like the roguelite aspect a lot, but it's kind of cool to see someone doing it, you know, a bit different with a storyline. Now, it is, of course, in early access, as you probably already can tell, and it is actually in a pretty good state, in my opinion, in the early access campaign. There's already quite a bit here to actually interact with, but the game is, of course, not done yet. Not all the characters are in. There's probably going to be more chapters to it and some other stuff like that, and they're always looking for new card ideas and new strategies and things that players can post that they can implement into the game to make it more varied. The game is it's $15 right now, and it is going to raise in price towards its release. I'm not sure exactly how much, maybe 20, for instance, who knows, but it is currently $15, and it's available right now on the Steam Early Access system, and they plan on making the full release sometime in the second half of the year, so quarter 3, quarter 4, 2019, sometime there it'll probably come out and be finished. So overall, what I've shown you in the background is only one character, and is mostly in the second chapter of 4 current chapters in the game, but it is still quite varied and pretty interesting. And like I said, it's really about, for me at least, it's about finding these games that use mechanics that I'm familiar with from other games and that I know I really enjoy, but have some way of standing out and doing things differently, and this game definitely does. But like I said, not everyone is going to enjoy the idea of the deck of ashes, as it were, because it is it's limiting. It's not necessarily as limiting as it sounds, but it is actually something that you have to keep an eye on a lot to actually make your strategies work. I just find the extra bit of added difficulty from that pretty interesting. So that is Deck of Ashes, available right now in Steam Early Access. Wishlisted if you would like to keep an eye on it for its full release, or just check it out right now below. The link is, of course, in the description as always, and any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.